Welcome to this edition of Labor Vision. I'm Bob Delaney, Executive Director of the Institute for Labor Studies and Research. Labor Vision, a production of the Institute, focuses on topics of importance to working Rhode Islanders. We hope you enjoy this edition.
Welcome to Labor Day 2020. My name is James Parisi. I'm a field rep with the Rhode Island Federation of Teachers and Health Professionals, and most importantly today, I'm president of the Rhode Island Labor History Society. And thank you for joining us on our annual Labor Day address, where we commemorate working people and their organizations and their unions every Labor Day, and we do it here at Meshassack Cemetery. The Rhode Island Labor History Society is an organization dedicated to preserving and promoting the history of working people and their unions. We were formed 33 years ago. We host a variety of programs throughout the year. We do so on a variety of topics, not all specifically related to unions, but also related to working people and the issues and the struggles they dealt with. We give money to students who do labor-oriented projects when they participate in Rhode Island History Day. We host an annual banquet where we honor labor leaders every summer. Unfortunately, due to the pandemic, we had to cancel this year's event, but we look forward to honoring 4 terrific labor leaders at our annual banquet, which will be held next year on August 19th. Normally, the Labor History Society contributes money to the Museum of Work and Culture so they could be open free of charge on Labor Day. And again, due to the pandemic, that's not possible this year, but I do want to let everyone know that the Museum of Work and Culture has put together a video series over the Labor Day weekend. They've been offering different videos, releasing them every day over a 5-day period on topics related to labor history. So go to the Museum of Work and Culture's website and Facebook page so that you could check it out. We're beginning a series of online events with a presentation on September 23rd with a talk titled Dark Work, the Business of Slavery in Rhode Island, which is going to be offered by Professor Christy Clark-Pujara of the University of Wisconsin at Madison. More information will be posted soon on our website and Facebook page. So welcome to Meshassack Cemetery in Central Falls, where every year, now for 10 years since we've dedicated this monument, we've come together on Labor Day to recognize that this is an important holiday, not just having the day off, but thinking about, talking about, acting on the struggles of working people that they've had over the years. Last year, we heard a stem winder from Justin Kelly of the Painters Union. And this year we welcome Miriam Reumann to address us. Miriam is a professor of history over at University of Rhode Island. She concentrates on issues related to sexuality, gender, and social sciences. She got her Ph.D. down the street at Brown University. Probably most importantly, she's a member of the Rhode Island Labor History Society Board and a leader of her own faculty union at URI, the AUP chapter, where she currently serves as president of their executive committee. Miriam, welcome. The podium is yours.
Thanks, Jim, and to echo him, thank you everyone for coming literally and now or later virtually to our Labor Day commemoration here at Meshassack Cemetery. Am I getting that right? The pronunciation, Pat? Not a native Rhode Islander? Meshassack. Okay, good. I'm still embarrassed by some of my early graduate school descriptions of what beach I was going to. The shame will never end for the mispronunciations. So, as Jim gestured to, this particular Labor Day of 2020 is host to a bunch of anniversaries. It's the 86th anniversary, of course, if my math is right, of the 1934 uprising, textile strike, and the Saylesville Battle of the Gravestones. It's the 10th anniversary, as he mentioned, of the unveiling of this plaque, this history monument. It is also the 100th anniversary, not quite to the day, of national women's suffrage in the United States. Rhode Island, as everybody here knows quite well, has long been a site for labor-related activism. from the Door War over property qualifications for voting, to leading the nation's first Labor Day parade in 1882. I didn't check up on that too carefully because it just sounded really good, so I thought, fine, I'll go with it. Whatever online source I found, I'm trusting. It is correct? Okay, good. And, of course, also things like the streetcar strike of 1902, Scott's turf, and the 1922 textile strike prior to what we're talking about today. These events all helped create a rich past history and to set the stage for the events we're talking about today. And I know many of you here today or watching at home are familiar with the basic events, so I'll focus on the central points. So in the 1930s, Rhode Island was, of course, well known for its jewelry and textile works, along with maritime industries, brick making, lace making, a ton of other trades. I love when I have local students in a class where I cover immigration, because my bet with them is that if they can tell me where their grandparents, great-grandparents, whoever they were, lived and where they came from and what year, I have about an 80% chance of telling them what labor they did. And it's like a cool parlor trick you can do. Barrington, your grandma made lace. Moving on. Seriously, it's really fun. And the Great Depression, of course, had brought massive layoffs, wage cuts, speed-ups, an intense economic anxiety and much anger for the immigrant and the native-born workforces of this era. Many were encouraged in 1933 by the passage of the National Industrial Recovery Act, or NIRA, a labor and consumer law that authorized the president to put some regulations on industry over wages and prices. In response to this quite mild and, in fact, largely toothless reform measure, many mill owners and managers in this area and elsewhere sped up the pace of work, requiring workers to handle larger and more and faster looms and really changing their work lives considerably. After strikes against this began in the South, the protest went national, kind of worked its way up the eastern seaboard, and a strike begins, as, again, this commemorates, and most of you know, in Rhode Island on the day after Labor Day, 1934. Now, research by our own Pat Crowley, who is currently running the camera, has really illuminated a lot of aspects of the strike that were less well known. And I can't claim anything remotely close to his detailed knowledge. But the central things we're noting today are the strike itself and the uprising of local workers and their battles, quite literally, with members of the National Guard and local police in what became known as the Battle of the Gravestones, leaving bullet holes around this cemetery. The striking workers and community and family members, many of them not members of the workforce here, faced off against police and National Guard troops who fired on them in the streets, in the cemetery, and several days of civic uprising spread to Woonsocket and elsewhere. So the 1934 events in this cemetery, again commemorated by this memorial, and today's annual event were, of course, intensely local, led by folks from Pawtucket, Woonsocket, Central Falls, right up the street. But of course they were also, as labor struggles are today, tied to national issues. In that case, it was the long history of exploitation by industrial employers, the exacerbation of poverty and degradation of work during the Great Depression, and the climate of public opinion for workers who spoke out, rose up in any way against their condition was quite harsh. In the 1930s, local organizers were described as, quote, breeders of discontent, which I would wear that t-shirt. That sounds like a really awesome thing we should reclaim. And during the clashes between local workers and the military, Governor T.F. Green predictably called the uprising a communist insurrection, complete with, I think, multiple exclamation points. And I got to pause here and say that when I teach this, I will almost always later have students wander up to me and say, hey, now when I fly out of T.F. Green, I think about labor struggle. Again, I will take that. That seems like a win. Not all of them, but some. So, like many such actions, this strike was not a success. 4 protesters were killed between here and Woonsocket. The goals of the strike were not won, for the most part, as mill owners were backed up by local officials and law enforcement. The strike, like many, though, was significant beyond that. It showed the extent of worker anger and determination and ability to come together to some extent. It also affirmed the gestures towards organized labor that were embedded in the NIRA, and those would be considerably strengthened, of course, in the following year's Wagner Act, ushering in an era of expanding labor rights, not for everyone, but for many rank-and-file members. Some of those advances have since been lost, or to be more direct, have been deliberately taken away. But there are always new battles to be fought, new opportunities amid the crises, including that of the present. So I've sketched out a much longer history of some wins and a lot of losses. And what I want to focus on for the rest of the time I have today, which will be pretty brief, is what do events like the strike and the Battle of the Gravestones mean now? What do we do with them? If we want a usable past, if we want to look to history not just for inspiring stories or depressing stories, and those I would argue are usually enmeshed, but for something that we can use. Something that, as Mark Twain allegedly put about the past, isn't going to be exactly the same, but it might rhyme. Where do we go for that? Well, so at a moment, especially when terms like essential worker have come to the fore and often mean having fewer choices, fewer options, fewer rewards than one would hope someone who is essential does, and at a moment of less protection in dangerous times, both literally from viruses and in larger way from exploitation in the workforce. How can we sort of look to the past for suggestions? So I want to look very briefly at three important and heavily overlapping, interlocking issues of both the past and present for maybe a few ideas at a time of attacks on labor. And to be fair, I defy you to find any moment in American history when there aren't attacks on labor. Some are better, some are worse. But right now, I'd say it feels pretty bad, right? The first issue is going to be concerns and activism of the largely female workforce, textile unions in the past, other groups now, such as educators and public sector unions. The second would be racial justice, whether in the workplace, the courts, the voting booth, the streets. And the third is the much more immediate, well, not much more immediate, but the very specific and new threat of conditions created by the ongoing pandemic. So for each, I want to ask quickly, what can we take from the past to help us frame and understand the present, but also to help us create the kind of labor movement and political change that we want and we need? To start with, gender. As I mentioned, American women's suffrage was ratified in 1920, and many women, of course, could not access the vote due to their race, their poverty, or other factors. The textile workers who loom so large in the history of labor activism, and in this very event, were largely women, often, were used to being viewed by many union leaders and some male co-workers as temporary workers, laboring for pin money, not really committed to a union, not really capable, as many saw, of understanding, even though there are plenty of examples to contradict that. Women were, of course, front and central in Rhode Island strike action, like one person Pat introduced me to, for whom I have great fondness, 16-year-old Rita from Central Falls, who faced down armed soldiers and challenged them, basically, come at me. Today, we have a kind of parallel, maybe, situation. Largely female workforces have been intensely active on the front lines in the successful teachers' union protests of 2018, 2019, and I would argue 2020 as well, and the 2019 Stop and Shop strike victory. Today, one thing that we have to contend with that is both old and relentlessly new is a kind of fetishization of only certain kinds of labor as really American, as really deserving of reward. And it tends to be jobs that are held by men, especially white men. And this, of course, is very much supported by much of the current administration. This sense of who matters, who's an appropriate sort of recipient of benefits, is corrosive and really harms the larger movement. Elevating certain jobs as manly, that, because they've been traditionally performed by a certain group, harms labor solidarity, overlooks the centrality of women workers, and we need to constantly remember, if we're in any danger of forgetting, which this group generally isn't, who exactly is out on the front lines now. A second and very much related set of concerns centers on, again, both historically and today, race and ethnicity. As Justin Kelly emphasized in his address last year, immigrant workers were at the heart of the Rhode Island labor movement. They were front and center in the 1934 protests. And among many examples we see from the present, and I'm going to be really selective here and pick something that's literally in the last week or two, an especially current one is how visible racial justice concerns have become in, of all places, American sports, which have essentially pretty powerful unions within a limited framework. We have a long historical record of individual black athletes, or small groups of them, asserting their political consciences, often at the cost of their careers and the kind of rewards they could have otherwise expected. And there have been isolated incidents of teams or divisions battling together for some kind of labor concessions, like the Big Ten, I believe it was, forgive me if my sports reference is wrong, fighting for longer-term health insurance for college players. But it's far more recent that we see sports teams engaging in wildcat strikes over racial justice issues. I mean, that was not on my bingo card for 2020. I'm delighted that it's there, but would not have predicted that. And what I found interesting is that the coverage of this focused largely on how unexpected this was, how unprecedented it was, and also, of course, the inconvenience of a delayed season or game, because that's just really cutting at the heart of everything that matters. But I would argue we need to frame a lot of these recent strike actions, such as that by the NBA and the WNBA, as a form of community unionism, in which striking was not over hours and wages and the usual kinds of issues, but about the larger importance of mobilizing scarce resources for the larger community, whether through attention to voting rights and access, or calling attention to larger issues of policing, violence, and racial justice. So labor activists today may not be hiding behind gravestones and dodging National Guard bullets in a cemetery that I know of, but the protesters are still being attacked by police during peaceful protests. So the details change, but the general form doesn't. The struggles are the same, and maintaining the ties between social justice unionism and a more traditional form of workplace organizing offers relevance, new hope for the movement, and I believe will continue to draw in new groups of people. The last big issue that I want to consider is the impact of the current and ongoing pandemic. What does it mean to be a worker and to potentially withhold one's labor in 2020? Being deemed essential, as I mentioned earlier, is often linked not to improved working conditions or respect or autonomy, but instead to an even greater loss of control over these things. In the COVID era, we see obviously epidemiological links between unsafe workplaces and illness and the spread of disease. And again, there's a long history here, even if the details vary. I would argue that in many ways, we're right back in the progressive era United States. Scratch out diphtheria and write in coronavirus, and it looks fairly similar. And the crowded conditions, poor air circulation, etc., prove dangerous to workers today, just as they were for textile factory workers, meat cutters, cigar makers, and so many others a century ago. So what do we do with this? To wind up, I quoted FDR in my little mini description of this talk before I had actually written it, and hoped it would end up lining up. And he said in his 1941 Labor Day speech that, quote, "Trade unionism demands full freedom of expression and peaceful assembly. Trade unionism has helped to give everyone who toils the position of dignity which is his due." A 2020 edit would make it his or her or their due, but whatever, it's FDR, I'll give him some credit for that. And as FDR saw it, while urging Americans to work hard to preserve and support Lend-Lease, and within a very few months, our own entry into World War II, fair treatment and rights for labor were not something to be sacrificed. They were rather something to be demanded and underlined and made part of the larger battle against fascism and erosion of democracy. So the way he phrased it is that fair treatment of and rights for labor were, and I quote, crucial to the maintenance of democracy. This is no less true today, maybe even more, under an administration that hates and fears both labor rights and democracy, I would argue. And as the party in power has eviscerated parts of the NLRB, has urged so-called right-to-work legislation, filled the courts with anti-union nominees, and gutted workplace safety regulations, it's ever more vital that unions keep on rolling up our sleeves to fight and making that fight vital and connected to these other struggles for justice. Bottom line is the past and the present both demonstrate the centrality of worker activism, whether it be the Ford sit-down strike, or taking to the streets in protest in 1934, or teachers' union campaigns in Arizona, Oklahoma, West Virginia, of all unexpected places. At this very moment, as schools are beginning to reopen, teachers worry about their safety in classrooms and ability to perform our work in ways that are as safe as possible. For an example, I teach, as Jim mentioned, at URI, and I get to teach in whatever modality I want because I have a strong union, I have the superpowers of Jay Walsh, who many of you know, on our side, and that means I can do whatever I want. Colleagues at other universities, especially the non-unionized ones, are far less fortunate. One friend just told me recently she had been granted permission as a 55-year-old with a health condition to teach remotely only because a dean pulled strings for her. People who are less fortunate are teaching face-to-face at her university, and that's appalling. So at a time when new organizing is led largely by women and by people of color, who insist on the connection between these different threats, different crises, we have to work in solidarity with campaigns for racial justice, for gender equality, for protection of the public health, and for ensuring expanding and continued voting rights. We must build our relationships and engage in the incredibly difficult and annoying but necessary work of solidarity, even when it hurts. Because for FDR, almost 80 years ago, unions maintained a democracy that had been transformed by a new relationship to the state. We need to go back to and restore and update that kind of democracy. Thank you.
Thank you all for coming.
Thank you for joining us for this edition of Labor Vision. We appreciate your input and encourage your comments. Labor Vision can be seen on this channel 3 times each week: Tuesday at 7 p.m., Thursday at 8 p.m., and Saturday at 5 p.m.